Who's underproofed? Who's overproofed? Only time will tell. And by time, I mean in the next minute, you're gonna find out. There are a variety of different methods that you can use to proof and bake your bread. It all depends on the type of recipe that you're working with, the type of dough, what your desired end result is. But in this chapter, I'm going to go over a couple of these methods with you, some very simple ones with very simple tools in your kitchen so that you can get your bread baked. Before we get into the actual process, what exactly is proofing? You've made your dough, you put it on your countertop, you take your bench knife, and you cut it in half. And what happens when you cut your dough is we're actually disrupting that strong gluten formation that we've created. So it's very important that we find a way to re-strengthen our pieces of dough before they go into the oven. So after our dough is cut and shaped, this second rise called proofing allows our dough to get extra strength before going into the oven. Now you might be thinking, all right, my dough is shaped, where do I put it? You know, depending on the type of dough that you've made, depending on the type of bread that you want to bake, there are many different proofing vessels that you can use. I've got a couple of my favorites right here in front of me. A simple cutting board is great because all you need to do is shape your dough, put a little bit of flour or, you know, some semolina, some wheat bran on here so it doesn't stick, and put your shaped dough on there. It's a great way to use what most people already have in their kitchen. These nice baskets are great. I consider them a bit of a bonus tool because they're made out of a special type of wood. They promote more airflow around the dough, which helps in the proofing process. But don't worry, they're not necessary. I've made very, very delicious bread using any kind of tool that I've got in the kitchen, as long as the dough fits it. When we're proofing our dough, whether we're proofing it at room temperature where it's warmer or putting it in the fridge where it's a little bit colder, it's very important that we cover our dough so that it doesn't develop a hardened skin on the dough. We want our dough to remain soft and supple. So if you're proofing your dough on a cutting board, you can take a kitchen towel and throw it right over there, and that'll prevent that draft from affecting and drying out your dough. If you're proofing in a basket or a bowl and you're getting it into the fridge for a nice cold fermentation, using a simple plastic bag or plastic wrap, even aluminum foil directly over your basket works to prevent that cold draft from drying your dough out. All right, I have some dough that I've had in the fridge for various times because I want to show you the difference between a dough that's perfectly proofed, underproofed, and overproofed. One of the things you want to look for in terms of your final proof and fermentation is growth. You want to see a little bit more size increase in your shaped dough. As you can see here, when compared to the other two, we don't have much size increase. We don't have much development. We've got a few small bubbles, but not much is really happening in this dough. So, got a little bit of water here. I'll just get the tips of my fingers wet. And this is so that your fingers don't stick to the dough, all right? So I'm gonna press down gently here, and the indentation has virtually bounced all the way back up. And it's an indication that the gluten structure is extremely strong, hasn't really degraded too much, which means that our air pockets aren't really going to be able to break through during the bake. Fortunately, this isn't really a problem. It just means you need to let your dough ferment for a longer period of time. At some point, always with time, your dough will proof up to the right stage and be ready to bake. Next, I'm gonna show you this dough right here. We've got a very, very full volume that's occurred here. As I wobble this basket, you can see the dough moving, you can see the structure and air developed. All right, so we're going to poke into our dough here, and what you can see here is that it's not necessarily coming back up, and the reason for that is because our gluten formation has degraded, maybe fully, it's just fully degraded, which means it's not really going to be able to support any kind of air and gas that needs to go up during the bake process. You can still bake this bread and it will be delicious. You can change the baking vessel, you can put it on a sheet pan and flatten it out, with some olive oil and make a flatbread. Or you can just go ahead and continue to bake it in your Dutch oven or combo cooker. It might not rise very tall, but it will actually be very delicious. Chances are this loaf has a lot of flavor built into it because of how long it has been fermenting. Last but not least, we have a dough in the middle here. We've got a healthy amount of small bubbles forming here. So we've got size more increased than our underproofed loaf, but not as wobbly and unstable as our overproofed loaf. So you guessed it, this loaf to me looks perfectly proofed. So what we're looking for when our dough is perfectly proof is that we want it to bounce back a little bit, but not all the way up. All right, and this means that the gluten formation has degraded slightly, but not to the point to where it can't handle that amount and volume of air that needs to be dispersed during the bake. So you can see a difference here. It's bounced up a little bit. This indentation is still sitting there, very wobbly. And over here, we have no indentations at all. So these are the very, very simple techniques that you can use to tell when your dough is ready to be baked. I've been preheating my Dutch oven at about 500 degrees, very, very hot. You can use a Dutch oven, you can use our combo cooker here or a pizza stone for this specific recipe. And it's important that we've got our baking vessel fully heated so that when this cold dough hits it, you get that reaction of air pushing up and giving us that oven spring and that rise that we desire. All right. I'm actually scoring this loaf, which means I'm gonna cut the top of it. I've got a simple razor blade here. You can also use a very sharp paring knife or a serrated knife. There we go. All right. I'm just gonna hit it with what looks like a Z shape. You can do a tic-tac-toe pattern, you can do a square, you can do a cross. You can see the structure of the dough. It's a good indication of nice fermentation when you give it a score and see a little bit of those holes, that structure. Now I'm going to get the Dutch oven out. All right, here, always remember, make sure you're using something that's gonna protect your hand. It's very hot, so I'm gonna open this up and very quickly drop it in. We're gonna keep the lid on and get it back into the oven. What I'm going to do is I'm gonna actually lower the temperature of the oven just a little bit from 500 to anywhere between 450 and 475. The dough itself is actually going to release its own moisture, and that moisture keeps the crust soft so that it can continue to expand in the oven. And this process takes about 20 minutes. Close the oven to keep the heat in there. Right, this is very nice. All right, as you can see here, we've got a very simple scoring pattern. So I'm very happy with the size of the dough, nice oven spring there. All that's left is to let it kind of solidify, let the crust solidify, let some of the moisture out, and let it continue to cook. So I'm gonna remove the lid and then put it back into the oven. Back in we go for another 20 minutes. Our loaf has been in the oven for a total of about 40 minutes, and now it's finally time to get that bread out of the oven. I like that. That's beautiful. All right, absolutely spectacular loaf. You want to be very careful with your loaf and just kind of gently pick your loaf up like this. Slide it right onto the cooling rack. All right, so we're looking at our loaf of bread here. We can tell it's done. You get that nice hollow sound when you tap the bottom of it. We're gonna let it cool for about 10 minutes or so because I wanna rip this bread open. But even if I wanted to slice it, it's good to let it cool so that you don't rip the inside of the bread. It's still kind of cooking and formulating in there. It does need to cool down a little bit. And if I were to rip it right now, oh man, I might lose the most important tools that I've got. All right, so we're gonna let our bread cool for a minute and then we're gonna check out the inside. All right, we have set the scene here for the consumption of bread. You know, there's nothing better than rewarding yourself after a beautifully baked loaf of bread comes out of the oven. And I'm kind of just at a loss for words because it's time to check out how beautifully it was baked on the inside. And you know my style, I like to just dig into it. Oh, that's nice. Look at that. I want the flavor that's coming out of in this vapor. That's good. It smells supreme. I'm seeing a lot of wonderful things here. I'm seeing a nice, soft texture on the inside. The fragrant aroma of these flowers is it's just hard to describe sometimes how delicious freshly baked bread is. So yeah, it's time to eat some, I suppose. I'm gonna have a little bit of olive oil to dip it in. Get a nice dip, nice coating of olive oil there. Olive oil is such a great partner to bread, just like butter. You really can't go wrong. All right, a little bit of rosemary there. Every time. There's all of your sensory elements working, the sound of the crackling crust, the smell permeating your nose, the way it looks, the way it feels, the warmth, the way the texture feels. And last but not least, the way it tastes. This whole process of making bread, it's described in that bite. Like, it's the whole story gets told in that bite. In this chapter, we learned how to proof our shaped dough, bake our proofed loaves, and I hope that you're now empowered to start baking your own bread at home.